Defense of the Mother Country. Colonial ties. 1939 to 1945. In context. Focus. Impact on colonies. Before 1914 and 1918, vast numbers of people in the colonies fight for the Allies in World War I. After 1947, India achieves independence from Britain. 1949, some former British colonies agree to recognize the British monarch as head of the Commonwealth but not as their head of state. 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu marks the defeat of French colonial forces in Indochina. 1962, Algeria wins its independence from France after a bitter 8-year war. Germany possessed some overseas colonies at the start of the war, but its empire was small compared to the imperial domains of Britain, France, and Belgium, whose colonies provided resources and manpower for their war effort. The British assumed that their colonies would support them, and the Belgian Congo declared for the Allies in January 1941. However, after the creation of Vichy France following the German occupation of France, French colonies had to decide whether to recognize the Vichy or the Free France government led by Charles de Gaulle in exile in London. French colonies. Initially, most of the French Empire recognized Vichy authority. This included Indochina, where the French ruled a series of provinces consisting of modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In July 1940, the Vichy regime installed a new Governor-General, Vice Admiral Jean Decoux, who quickly discovered the French authority there was a fiction. The real power in the region was Japan, which was demanding free access and garrison rights. Japanese control. In September 1940, Japanese troops invaded French Indochina. Despite raising a local army supplemented by 20,000 foreign legion troops, the French were completely outmatched by the Japanese military. For most of the rest of the war, the Japanese had free rein to exploit the region for natural resources, food, and transportation links. They allowed nominal French governance to control the provinces. The only effective resistance to Japanese hegemony came from the Viet Minh, a communist guerrilla organization formed in May 1941 by Ho Chi Minh with support from the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, or OSS for short. By October 1944, the Viet Minh had pushed back the Japanese and established an administration in northern areas. Disruptions to rice supplies eventually led to a famine in Tonkin, northern Vietnam, in 1945, which claimed the lives of up to 2 million people. When French Indochina came under the aegis of the Free French toward the end of the war, the Japanese suppressed the remaining French forces, massacring 1,700 troops. After the war, French colonial control was nominally reasserted, but Ho Chi Minh's independence movement could not be denied, and the French would eventually be driven out. A few French colonies courageously held out against the Vichy regime, including territories in India and the Pacific and the French Equatorial Africa, where the bold decision of Félix Éboué, governor of Chad, to declare support for Free France gave de Gaulle a vital base from which to build an alternative French empire. Belgium's colonies. The Belgian Congo, including the Mandate of Rwanda-Urundi, was a vast territory 80 times bigger than Belgium itself. In January 1941, after initial reluctance, the Belgian government in exile allowed the British to exploit the immense natural resources of the territory. The British eventually bought the Congo's entire warline production of copper along with other metals and radioactive ores. The initial supplies of uranium used in the development of the atomic bomb in the United States also came from there. Men from the Belgian Congo also fought in the war, serving in the Belgian Congo's Force Publique, which saw action in Africa and the Middle East. However, wartime Congo also saw minor strikes, army mutinies, and rebellions against the colonial authorities, partly in reaction to Belgium's long history of brutal colonial rule. Britain's black combatants. Thousands of Africans were pressed into the British war effort, sometimes working as forced labor supplying raw materials. Reduced traffic through the Suez Canal as a result of the war forced British ships traveling to South Asia and the East to travel around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope. More than 150,000 West African troops and some East African brigades were sent to Burma, where they served under white officers. African soldiers were not used as combatants in the European theater because it was felt to be unacceptable for black Africans to kill white people. Although there was no official color bar to black people joining the British military services, Churchill stipulated that administrative means should be found to prevent their acceptance. This informal bar was overcome by West Indians who protested at being denied the opportunity to serve. Eventually, around 300 West Indians served in the Royal Air Force's aircrew, winning 90 decorations including 7 Distinguished Service Orders. In 1944, a Caribbean regiment was recruited and posted to Egypt to guard prisoners of war, only to be drawn into conflict with whites after African troops objected to black men being allowed to bear arms. India joins the conflict. British India was not permitted the luxury of choice when it came to joining the war. In 1939, without consulting the Indian Congress, British Viceroy Lord Linlithgow declared that India was at war with Germany. This failure to consult sparked bitter debate among Indian politicians, especially those who were already seeking independence from Britain, such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. Over 2.5 million Indians would serve during the war. The 4th Indian Division, for instance, fought in North Africa, Syria, Palestine, Cyprus, Italy, where it participated in the bloody assault on Monte Cassino, and Greece, winning 4 Victoria Crosses. The 5th Indian Division fought in North Africa and guarded Iraqi oil fields before being sent to Burma, Malaya, and Java, also winning 4 Victoria Crosses. Bravery and sacrifice. In all, the Indian Armed Forces, which included the Royal Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force, later Royal, lost more than 36,000 members with another 64,000 injured and won 4,000 awards for gallantry, including 1 Victoria, 31 VCs. One of those to receive a Victoria Cross was Havildar Gajay Ghale of the 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, who was badly wounded during an attack on Japanese forces in Burma in May 1943. According to a citation, Gajay Ghale dominated the fight, hurling grenades and covered in blood from his own wounds. He led assault after assault. India would pay a high price for its service to Britain. Along with millions of troops, including the largest volunteer army in history, it provided vast quantities of food and raw materials for Britain. The impact on domestic resources led to disastrous food shortages in 1942 to 1943, with the loss of 3 million lives in the Bengal famine. War in the Dominions. While they were no longer British colonies, the Dominions of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada all declared war alongside Britain, even though they still bore the scars of the losses they had sustained in World War I, and public opinion was divided about the war in Europe. In Australia, for instance, there was widespread opposition, yet in April 1939, the country's new Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, declared if Britain was at war, Australia was too. Later on, after the 1941 Japanese bombing of the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, and especially the fall of Singapore and Japan's raid on Darwin in 1942, Australian support for the war hardened. In Canada, the political skill of Premier Mackenzie King was vital in securing support for the war, partly by pledging that there would be no conscription for overseas service, and partly by promising a war of limited liability, supplying only as many men as was necessary at any given time. New Zealand made the greatest contribution proportionally of any of Britain's existing or former colonies, losing a greater percentage of its population, 0.67%, and spending a proportion of national income that was equal to the UK's. South Africans were more wary than other dominions, but narrowly voted during Britain's declaration of war. The participation of colonies and dominions created multiple fronts on which the war could be prosecuted. India, which occupied a strategic position between the African, Middle Eastern, and Pacific theaters, came under threat both in the West, with Nazi dreams of striking through the Middle East, and in the East, with Japan's successes bringing the war perilously close. North Africa, which was under the control of Vichy France, became the theater where the Allies tried to turn the tide of war in their favor. Félix Éboué. Adolphe Félix Sylvestre Éboué was born in French Guiana, a French colony on the coast of South America, in 1884. A brilliant student, he won a scholarship to study at the top schools in France and enjoyed a distinguished career in the French colonial bureaucracy. He became the first person of African ancestry to hold the post of colonial governor, first in Guadeloupe, then in Chad. In World War II, Éboué recognized the invidious nature of Nazi doctrine and declared support for the Free French in July 1940, rallying Chad and the rest of the French Equatorial Africa to resist the Nazi puppet regime of Vichy France. In November 1940, de Gaulle appointed Éboué general governor of French Equatorial Africa. Settling in Brazzaville, the capital of Free French Africa in the Congo, Éboué worked for the Free French and proposed reforms to French colonial policies in the post-war period. Eboué died in Cairo in 1944. His ashes were interred in the Pantheon in Paris in 1949, making him the first black person to be buried there.